Thank you for joining me for this virtual fall weed out coordinator training. It is that time of year again. It always creeps up real fast on us, doesn't it? Here is what the standard outline of this presentation looks like. To go ahead and let all of you follow along with this. Start with the introduction. My name is Hallie Minzer. I'm the restoration ecologist for the Milwaukee County Parks Natural Areas program. We just have a few updates for the fall 2023 season. There have been a couple staff members who have left parks in areas that are relevant to the weed out program. And then I have included a new slide on protocols for plantings in natural areas versus plantings in turf. So I think that could use a little bit of clarification. And then finally, a lot of individuals got their herbicide, pesticide applicator licenses back in 2018, so a good amount of them are expired now or are going to be expiring soon for some other members as well. So just a reminder to go ahead and keep those current if you do want to have your park keep removing these woody invasive species by cutting them. Here is what the breakdown of Milwaukee County Parks looks like from a staff perspective. And what's going to be relevant is our trails coordinator, Jessica, has left and Jacob has filled that position. And then Rebecca Beggs, I have to update it on her, but our coworker there has just been promoted to be our second restoration ecologist alongside me. So we're all very excited for her to take that step up as well. And Emily as well, I believe this is new since the last weed out refresher, has had her position reclassified as conservation biologist. Also very exciting news there. There are a number of county ordinances that are certainly a good thing to know when there's any planting or digging, as I'm sure the vast majority or all of you are aware. If you're going to be doing that planting or digging, a permit's going to be required. This is often relevant for contacting Digger's Hotline, which I'll go over later in the presentation as well. Harvesting of native plants, seeds, that's illegal unless you have special volunteer privileges and have been approved for that by our program here. And what I've added here is dogs on leash. It is a $250 fine for each off-leash dog if the rangers were to show up and issue those citations. That's definitely can end up being a lot of money there. And dogs are a really bad problem ecologically being off-leash. They can spread invasive species and they can be very damaging to breeding grassland birds, for instance. So it's not trivial that we ask owners to keep their dogs on leash in areas that aren't designated as dog parks. So you could always gently remind them that that is how much the fine is. It's quite a steep fine. And then the next few slides are just showing what our program does, the Natural Areas program, because we often get those questions. What are you guys doing all the time? What are you guys doing in winter? You can't possibly be working outside. And well, of course we are. So we do tons of restoration and invasive removal. This is really a lion's share of what we do. This keeps us busy, keeps us always in a job year-round. We do a lot of native plantings and seed dispersal. So every season we have a fall tree planting, end of October, beginning of November, where we take one of our agricultural fields out of rotation and we plant it to trees. We also do pollinator garden installations. We've been vamping up our native seed collection and propagation program within our parks as well. Vegetative mapping is a good chunk of what we do. We need to be aware of what plants we have in our parks, where they are, how their populations are doing, that sort of thing for both natives and invasives. Wildlife surveys. We do all kinds of wildlife surveys, and some of these are also our community science surveys. So bumblebee monitoring, wetland monitoring, nest box monitoring, and a whole slew of others. And then backtracking to, if it lets me backtrack, apparently not. This is only a forward-moving PowerPoint. Well, in the previous slide, it was illustrating our land management plans. We have land management plans for the majority of our parks that are on a 10-year time scale, but how we manage these different parks and the different sections within the parks all really varies. And it's really important that we have the background data collected for these parks, all these different items to go ahead and give us the most informed ways and processes that we can manage our over 10,000 natural acres that we have in the park system. So really what we are here in the Natural Areas program to do, and what you all help us with the Weed Out program, you help support us, is to protect these existing high quality natural areas, really maintaining, ideally increasing our native plant and wildlife diversity, and really trying to reduce the negative impact of invasive species. I won't go over all these figures, but it is really astounding. So many people think, oh, you live in a major urban center, you can't have that much biodiversity, it's really got to be not a lot of plants, not a lot of animals, and these numbers just really illustrate that that is not true in the slightest. We have many different types of habitat here within the park system, and how we manage them is going to be different. How an invasive species might do in a woodland versus a prairie is a very simple way to illustrate how we use different tactics for different habitat types when managing invasive species. Just a little bit more illustration. We worked up these numbers about a year or two ago now. We have been increasing these every year for plenty of these different taxa in here. So just tons of native biodiversity that we are really proud of and that we want to keep having existing in our park system. Don't want to get too doom and gloom, but yes, there are threats to natural areas, and we've got quite a few of them. So habitat fragmentation, urban development, climate change, everything on that list. Illegal collecting has been especially devastating to particular species. Ferns and wild leeks are a couple that come to mind. Dogs off leash I already mentioned, but then feral cats as well. Feral cats, I always like to say that they have been reported to kill more birds in this country than the birds that die as a result of striking windows. Deer browse, that is one of the toughest issues for us to go ahead and come up with a solution for, because we have a huge overpopulation of deer in Milwaukee County. We don't currently have hunting within our parks. That's not allowed. Maybe in the near future. Some of us would like to be seeing this because they are devastating to our forests. And then invasive species, what brings us all here today. Let's see, I have the park ranger on duty number, and I believe that little window is covering it up. There is a number, I think even if you just Google it and look up the Milwaukee County Parks Ranger on duty, you can find that easily enough, but I will make sure to make that number available to you all. And that number is to be used in case you see any illegal activity, maybe somebody's harvesting some native plants and they shouldn't, dogs off leash if you've got a really bad problem, if they're running throughout places where people are driving, that sort of thing. But our park rangers are very busy. So please only call them with pressing matters. See, I already talked about the ecological restoration management plans, and then we just have tons of data in Wisconsin, the country, the world, that show the devastating impacts of invasive species. Once again, I'm not going to read these numbers, but they are a very big threat, and we need all the help we can get to go ahead and keep them in check. So that is what brings us all together, the Parks Natural Areas program with Weed Out, the park people. We formed this partnership to make a really big difference to our local parks and the habitat and ecosystems there. All right, moving on to the second section, Weed Out Tools to Succeed. So once again, these next few slides I'll just go over rather quickly, but just as a reminder for those of you who are weed out coordinator and volunteer veterans, some nice information that you might want to reference, or if you're brand new, this is definitely information that's going to be extremely important for you to know for organizing the different weed outs and just making sure that the events go smoothly and how you would like them to go. So scheduling for the fall weed out dates, I'm asking by the end of the month if you can do your best to submit those dates to both me, the restoration ecologist, as well as Dana Hansen over at the Park People, the Park People director, and then if you want as well to send them to Ken Solis if you've been doing that already. And then we'll go ahead and come up with a calendar schedule for all of those weed out dates. So I highly appreciate you guys getting those dates over to us. Event preparation, just the big picture questions to be thinking about. Are we going to have enough tools and safety equipment for everybody showing up? It can be amazing sometimes how many people unexpectedly show up. Getting them those cuttings of the invasives to show as examples, getting them to look at these species up close, giving them those cuttings so that they can have them in their hand. Physically touching them is really going to help with identification until they start to get a little bit more comfortable later in the event. We do need special permission for children. You see all the details there. And then the volunteer waiver, the COVID waiver is no more. So there's just the single volunteer waiver that individuals only need to fill out once per year. That's not a calendar year, so it's 365 days from the day that they've signed it. You can have them scan this QR code, which I'll have to give you in PDF version, I'm thinking, because I don't think that's going to scan with that box in the way again. Otherwise, you could go to that link right there as well. And if you want to still use some of the hard copies because the individual doesn't have a smartphone on them, for instance, then you can still have them fill those out and kindly forward them as soon as you can to our office here at Parks Maintenance. So how many volunteers will we be leading is definitely a big question, because that's going to determine which areas of your park you're going to want to tackle. Obviously, if you have large groups, they're going to require more supervision, and you might want to, and you're definitely going to want to set them loose on an area that is a little more degraded or has very few good native plants in there. It's just kind of a massive invasive species. But if you have a small handful of veterans, you can work in a nicer area to really make even more impact on it. Tools that you'll be needing. Hand pulling can still happen with the small little buckthorn, honeysuckles, those sorts of things, so just gloves. But if you're doing the cut stump removal, you'll want your cutting tool, the hand saws or the loppers, and gloves and eye protection are mandatory. Even if somebody's wearing prescription eyeglasses, we do have the special over the glasses eye protection, which is mandatory to wear because they are ANSI certified and will keep that individual safe, whereas their prescription glasses are not rated to do so. And then finally, the certified pesticide applicator will have either a hand sprayer or the Dauber or Makutu to apply that herbicide. And I added herbicide log to this as well. That's one of the tools that I asked you to kindly fill out for each day that you're out there. This is the Makutu I'm talking about. I know that the park people have at least a few of these on hand, so it's basically a giant dauber that you fill with herbicide and can be really convenient because it prevents you from having to crouch down to treat every one of those stumps, which gets pretty tedious after a while. So connecting with your volunteers, really making sure, especially if they're newer volunteers, that they understand what the whole process involves. It never ceases to amaze me how you can go ahead and tell volunteers, hey, you're going to want to wear closed-toed shoes, long pants, and yet you get them showing up in shorts and flip-flops, which is not ideal at all. So really laying it out for them, let them know that, hey, even if it's not the best weather conditions, we might still be working, if it's really cold, for instance. And giving them a map to your site can be really helpful if it's a little bit confusing to get to. Here are just some tips for event promotion. If you're really looking to harness as many volunteers as possible for your event, Canva is a wonderful tool. We use it all the time here for Parks Natural Areas. It is a lifesaver. There is that invasive species education. I just want everybody to really pay attention to this part. Take the 15-20 minutes at the beginning of the session where you have your cuttings of your invasives and you're passing them around the circle, really having them tune in on those ID characteristics. Maybe give them 3 things and have them repeat them back to you. Sounds really simple, but this is going to save you so much time in the quality control department if you get them feeling comfortable with it right off the bat before they are set loose on these invasive species. It might seem like a waste of time on the front end of it because you would like to get cutting as soon as possible, especially if you have a bunch of people, but I cannot stress enough that please take the time to really go ahead and refresh them, even if they're returning volunteers, so that they are very comfortable with what these invasive species are like, because there are certainly look-alike species that can confuse even us veterans sometimes. So with the buckthorn, that's looking for that deer hoof. With the false thorn, that's in between the buds, really that scratching of the bark to have that orange color within the buckthorn is a really nice giveaway to distinguish it from other species. Otherwise, really hammering home that quality control. If you have a lot of volunteers, you might not be doing a lot of cutting yourself, a lot of treating yourself, because you just want to make sure that they are staying safe and that they are removing the buckthorn in a way that's going to be effective. So really making sure that the stumps are low to the ground and that they're flat is important too. It can be dangerous to have the stumps at an angle, and if you're spraying the stumps, if herbicide were to run off of it because it's at such an angle, that could be a problem. That's not going to be so much a problem with the dauber, but having them 2 inches to the ground or lower, that's going to be perfect so that that herbicide is effectively able to be taken up by the roots. Otherwise, most of the time we have our friends groups create brush piles within the natural areas in a designated area. Fewer brush piles is usually better. This is something that I like to discuss and try to illustrate with you in person for a site visit. So if you are interested in a site visit, I am very happy to meet you out there. We like to build our brush piles taller than they are wide so that they don't take up a lot of space on the ground, because we want to go ahead and have native plant species thrive there instead of having just this giant brush pile that is not going to allow native plants to grow there for some time, at least the herbaceous ones. Otherwise, we try to make them look as tidy as possible, and we tuck them away so that they're not a big eyesore right on the trail. Otherwise, watch if you're cutting a larger tree near a trail. You might want to have somebody be a lookout if it's near a particularly busy trail, just so that some passerby who's not paying attention doesn't accidentally get hit by a tree. Otherwise, making sure that the debris that you're cutting, if it is falling across the trail, that it's promptly removed from that trail. There are specific sizes that you want to be using for these trees when you're using the hand tools. So when you use a handsaw, you can go anywhere from 1 inch to 6 inches. Any bigger or smaller really isn't going to be effective. If you've got a pencil-sized plant, you want to probably just be hand pulling these. These come up easily enough if you get a good grip from the base. Any bigger than that's probably going to be pretty hard to do by hand. Otherwise, you might use one of those polar bear or weed wrenches to go ahead and get ones that are maybe 1 inch or a couple inches. But loppers, really, 1 inch is going to be a great size there. Another reason you don't want to do any smaller than 1 inch for loppers or handsaw is because any herbicide placed on that, there's just not enough width there of that plant stem for it to be effectively taken up by the roots. So there's no real reason to cut it because it's just going to resprout. Whereas if you can pull it out by hand or with a weed wrench, you're getting the roots, and voila, no reason for the herbicide to be used. All right, herbicide. Herbicide application and reporting. It is very important before you begin applying the herbicide that if you're going to be in areas where people might be walking, to put up the signs beforehand. And when you're putting up those signs, you put the date for the next day on there. So today is August 21st, so let's say you would put August 22nd down on that sign, and you could pick up those signs the following day. That's critical. Once you have applied that herbicide, or actually, I'm getting ahead of myself, so I do need to make sure that I have, for every friends group that will be applying herbicide, that I have an up-to-date commercial herbicide applicator license. And if you could please email that to me, or maybe even send me a text of a picture to that, I would really appreciate that, so that we know we have all of those ducks in a row. Otherwise, applying herbicide, make sure that volunteers are no longer cutting in that area so that they're not traipsing through the herbicide for safety reasons, of course. When you're treating that stump, you want to cover the cambium tissue. So basically, that's just going to be kind of the outer ring of the stem, and that's the actively growing part. The heartwood that's in the middle, if you start getting larger stems, that is not actively growing, it's dead, so that is not going to be taking up any of the herbicide, so there's no need to apply it to the center. So you just do a ring around the outside and maybe a little bit on the bark to the sides as it goes down. Whenever our crew treats, and I recommend for anybody, really do sweeps of the area as you're treating the stems, because you'll notice if you're coming from one direction and then you come from the other direction, you'll see that some got missed for whatever reason. So we'll kind of do a sweep of walking east to west, back west to east, and then north to south, that sort of thing. And it's really effective because we always miss stumps. And it's a lot nicer to get as many stumps as possible, ideally all of them, instead of having to deal with resprouts the following season. And finally, as I already mentioned, keeping track of the herbicide, how much you used for each day in the herbicide Excel sheet that I will provide all of you. So follow up, the majority of the friends groups, you are piling the brush in the natural areas. It breaks down just fine there. Those brush piles serve as fabulous wildlife habitat in there. They love the cover. But there are some instances where maybe there's not enough space to pile this brush, and we will have forestry staff come and pick it up. That does have to be prearranged. Please don't assume that they can come and pick it up. This can certainly cause problems to arise, so if you know that you need a forestry pickup, please reach out to me so that I can make sure this can be arranged that way. Okay, moving on to the strategies for removal. So I do have these maps available if you're curious. There are different ratings for different quality of habitat, how many invasives are there, how many good natives. So you can read the details of that if you're interested in having something like this for your park created, if you haven't received this in the past. This slide just really kind of gives you some of our thought process. There is a method behind the madness why we ask that you work in some areas over others. Really, the number one driving force behind it is we want to maintain those high quality sites before we start tackling the degraded ones, because it's just a much better use of your time and our time. It is much easier to make minimal improvements to a high quality area to make it even better than it is to start from a degraded site and build from the ground up. And then thinking about wildlife for the next three, wildlife corridors are very important in our parks. Stopover habitat for those migrating species, protecting sensitive wildlife habitat. Ephemeral ponds are a huge source of diversity in our parks, and I always love listening Emily when she gives her presentations talking about how ephemeral ponds are where wildlife wakes up in the spring, and it's very true. Otherwise, for invasive species in particular, looking at rapid response invasives is a huge way that we set our ecological priorities. There are some species, poison hemlock comes to mind, that we have only in fewer than a handful of parks that we are doing everything we can to snuff out. Otherwise, really thinking in the long term. I know you are all very familiar with this, but invasive species is not a one-year project. Even seeing how much can get done in a year is absolutely phenomenal to take a step back and look at. But if you can't continue to provide that maintenance that the site needs to keep removing those invasive species, keep it in check, prevent them from recolonizing, or removing what crops up from the seed bank if it's invasive still, that's a super important consideration to keep in mind. So timing and methods, I will be discussing not these summer species or spring species, but the fall and winter ones. So that for us is going to be the woody invasive species. Just a reminder, I know it can be really tempting to do woody invasive removal year-round. And while you can do this, you cannot do it with the cut stump method of herbicide. Because from April through June, if you're cutting these stems, they are sending their nutrients up from the roots, through the stems, through the shoots, and herbicide is not going to be effectively taken up by those roots because of the opposing forces there, right? So please don't ever be cutting these species either without treating or treating them with herbicide at the wrong type of year, because you see in this picture right here, oof, what was 2 stems ended up becoming a couple dozen, and it's just way more of a nightmare to treat. All right, with that, we have our invasive species number 1, buckthorn. So many people are very familiar with it. So you can still, any time of year, hand pull it or weed wrench it, as long as you can get it out of the soil and get all the roots. But otherwise, this season coming up here, late summer through winter, is a wonderful time to cut those larger stems close to the ground, nice and flat and level, and then treat them with the herbicide on that cambium layer. So perfect time for that. Fall, they're bringing those resources once again from the leaves all the way down the shoots into the roots. Buckthorn is going to have those glossy blue-black berries for the female trees. It is a dioecious species, so that means that there are female trees and male trees separately. If it doesn't have berries, you can still tell the buckthorn really by scratching that bark is one of my favorite ways, especially for beginners, because you do get that bright orange color. Otherwise, it's got all of these horizontal lenticels on the bark, so these spots on the bark that are for air exchange. That's a good way to tell it apart from some species, although a look-alike, the cherries, choke cherry especially, can look very similar. But it's not going to have that same bright orange bark. It's going to be more of a muted yellow orange bark, I would say. And then the leaves are huge for buckthorn. This takes a little bit more keying in with your eyes, but the buckthorn's going to have kind of these scalloped edges, and they kind of curve upward toward the tip of the leaf. And then you've got these veins, if you follow them closely, that instead of the veins going straight up and out, they kind of curve along the side of the leaf. And then we've got our other friend, honeysuckle. We do have native honeysuckles, just so that you're aware of that. We do have them in a good amount of our park systems, but they're never going to reach the size that these invasive bush honeysuckles reach. So these bush honeysuckles are going to be really big. They can get quite a bit taller than you or me. They're going to have this distinctive gray, tannish, light brown peeling bark. That's usually the easiest way to tell. So you see that distinctive bark paired with this shrubby multi-stem appearance of it. There's a good chance that's going to be honeysuckle. Otherwise, they've got opposite leaves, and the leaves are kind of nondescript. They're a little bit lighter green color than buckthorn. The buckthorn's really a dark green color. But if you see those berries, the berries can be different colors, but because there are different species. But that's a good way to tell them apart. Those berry clusters that might be orange or red, like these pictured here. And then if you cut through the honeysuckle, you're going to be seeing a hollow stem in there. So that's another good way to distinguish this species. This just harps on brush piles a little bit more, so ideally, once again, trying to put these brush piles in natural areas. It's a lot less work for everybody having to come and pick them up, but if you do have approval for forestry to pick up your brush piles, it's just going to be once a year, I believe, and then making sure that they're going to be nice and tidy. that all the stems are facing outwards. So this is a good example of what a brush pile would be like, because they'll show up with their special truck where they can go ahead and pile it in, and it's a lot easier when the brush piles are tidy like this. Fewer piles is generally better so that they don't have to make a whole bunch of stops along the trail. And then you can see that the stems in this picture almost go to the trail but not onto the trail, because you don't want them getting in the way of cyclists, runners, that sort of thing. Just more examples of brush piles. The one on the left looks great. The one on the right, not the worst, but they could have gone ahead and condensed them into fewer piles and then kept them out of the way of overhanging signs or lamps so that the machinery picking it up won't get in the way. This is just emphasizing again, I love illustrative photos. This shows what happens if the stumps are either cut too high and applied with herbicide where it's just not effective, and you get those resprouts, or maybe herbicide wasn't applied at all. It is much more annoying to cut a million small stems as well as the big stump that's left there than it is just to cut down a big single stump. Alright, so as I had mentioned earlier, I would just like to emphasize that there are a good amount of licenses that are expiring, have expired, or will be soon. So if you can please renew those at your earliest convenience, ideally in time for the fall weed out schedule if we can. Otherwise, this is the general herbicide tote, the materials that the park people provide for you to use on your site. A big reminder, if I could please get everybody to submit their herbicide reports at the very end of the year so that I can put that information into our parks database, because that's vital information for me to know how much herbicide and what type was put on the landscape. Otherwise, this is the herbicide report form that I ask you to fill out. If you don't know the acres or square footage, and it's just a small area you're working in, for those boxes you can just go ahead and say how many stems you treated, and that will be just fine for me. Otherwise, reminders about herbicide, storage, making sure that it's going to be in a secure, proper storage facility or storage locker that abides by what the herbicide manual talks about. And finally, the fun part. So planning for restoration, because of the invasive species, it is that multi-year process. So first of all, starting with the monitoring of this, the invasive species control step is likely going to be 3 to 5 years, if not more. Buckthorn, I believe, stays in the seed bank for 8 years. Even if you're removing all the berries before they form again, they can keep popping up from the seed bank. So you want to go ahead and monitor it so that you're still removing those plants popping up from there, but also you might start to see native plants returning once all the buckthorn is no longer there to stop suppressing it, and that's always really exciting to see. So you might have the land kind of heal itself without too much additional work from y'all to plant everything into it. From there, we've got recommended standards for what we do for planting trees. We recommend what we do in our own tree plantings are 3-gallon pots. Generally, the larger pot size you get, the more stressed the tree is. So for our natural areas, we suggest that smaller pot size there. You're going to see coming up in a minute that that is very different for turf areas for what forestry likes to have done. Otherwise, please come talk to me as soon as you start thinking about planting into your area. There is a whole process and it will take some time, but I'm very happy to guide you through the process. So I can go ahead and meet you for a site visit, talk about what species are going to be realistic for the habitat that you have in your desired planting area, and then we can go through tools, funding, all of those sorts of things. And if it's a larger project, or just depending on the scope of what you have in mind, it may need to go through the parks improvement process, which I can help guide you on as well, and that can take a bit more time for sure as well. All right, this is one of the new slides I was talking about. So just running down from one to the other, planting in natural areas, which many of you are familiar with, and I'm sure at least a handful of you are familiar with planting trees and turf, but they are a little bit different, and it's good to kind of understand the nuances. So planting in natural areas, you've worked with me, Emily, my predecessor Caitlin, to plant maybe tree whips in natural areas or plugs, that sort of thing. So you would come to the restoration ecologist and I would approve what species would work for that site, that sort of thing, placement. We would do the Diggers Hotline, or I would have someone from your group call the Diggers Hotline. So that's a distinction there. And I would have our park staff conduct the internal utility survey, which is separate. So there are actually 2 utility surveys that happen, one on your end and one on ours. I already mentioned the 3-gallon potted trees and shrubs. That's the size that works really well. Otherwise, just planning who's going to be doing this planting. For those natural areas planting, it's likely going to be Friends group members or potentially volunteers as well, separate volunteer groups. And you may need a plan for watering those plants, especially with all the hot, droughty weather that we've been getting. This is why it's especially nice to plant in spring once freezing is no longer likely to happen, or later in fall because we get more reliable rain during those times. So then distinguishing the natural area planting from the turf, this is completely separate departments that are going to be responsible for approving this, so they must be approved by Parks Forestry staff as well as planning and also potentially unit staff. Once again, if it's a larger project, it may be necessary to have these requests sent through the Parks improvement process. Another major question is asking yourself who's going to be planting these trees. Is it going to be forestry? We have to make sure that forestry has the resources and is willing to do this for you. Or are you going to have the contractor or the nursery plant it for you? If you have them do that, of course, you're going to have to pay them for their time, unless they're donating their time for some reason, and then they will also need a right of entry permit to be planting on parks land. Forestry requires 25-gallon ball and burlap trees. They don't want just a little dinky whip being planted because this is a highly visible area, so they want those larger size trees there, which certainly become more expensive. And then finally, this one, you don't have to do the Diggers Hotline. It's going to be either likely Parks Forestry or potentially the contractor as well, calling Diggers Hotline, and then doing that internal utility survey. So just a little bit of distinction there if you were also considering doing some turf plantings in there. But once again, that's forestry and unit staff's discretion if they even want those trees in there. From their implementation, I talked about the Diggers Hotline and the utility survey. There are specific time requests there. I ask that you please give me at least 2 weeks notice, or ideally much more time, so that we can get those requests in there and nobody's rushing around and trying to just run around getting these done last minute. Otherwise, Diggers Hotline needs to be at least 3 days in advance. I'd like to do that about a week in advance to make sure that that gets done in enough time. Otherwise, I'll finish out with this last slide here. We do have available opportunities for community science, different monitoring programs that we have, or native seed collection, those sorts of things. So if you have any interest there, or you think it would complement the wonderful work that you all are doing for invasive species removal in your parks, please reach out and let me know. With that, thank you so much for watching this fall weed out refresher. Please reach out with any questions and have a lovely fall season. Take care, you all.